Welcome to GW Institute for Korean Studies, or GWIKS. I'm Yeol Kim, Associate Director of GWIKS. Thank you for joining our Korea Policy Forum on assessing the Biden-Yoon Summit, a 70-year alliance and new thinking. Today's forum is co-sponsored by the East Asia National Resource Center at GW and the U.S.-China Policy Institute at Ajou University in South Korea. With that, let me turn it over to Jisoo Kim, Director of GWIKS, and Hoongyu Kim, Director of U.S.-China Policy Institute at Ajou University, for their welcoming remarks. Jisoo?
Thank you, Yeol. I would also like to start by welcoming to our last Korea Policy Forum of this academic year. I would like to also thank Yeol, our staff, and also U.S.-China Policy Institute at Ajou University for co-sponsoring this event. And I would like to especially thank Director Hoongyu Kim for his support and co-sponsorship of today's event. It's always delightful to work with Hoongyu and his institute. I hope we can continue our collaboration to generate critical discussions on the Korean Peninsula and the US-ROK relations. I would also like to thank our distinguished speakers for joining us today to share their views. Just about a year ago with U.S.-China Policy Institute, we hosted a panel discussion on the first Biden-Yoon Summit, Conventional and Economic Security. Last year, we had the event, I think about a week before the summit. So it was more about projecting how the summit would be, and the discussions, I think, was primarily focused on economic security. This time, we are hosting the event after the summit, so the discussion will focus more on the assessment of the summit. So last week's state visit to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the US-ROK alliance produced some significant results, such as Washington Declaration, but also left areas that could have been negotiated further. So I think there are many important issues to cover today. I'm grateful to learn from our distinguished speakers today. I look forward to hearing their insightful views. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Hoongyu.
Yeah. Hello, my name is Hoongyu Kim, co-host of this seminar and the director of the U.S.-China Policy Institute at Ajou University. I sincerely appreciate all the participants, especially from Korea and the United States, joining this seminar. And the Korean Center at George Washington University under the leadership of Director Jisoo Kim and also Yeol Kim. GWIKS has been in close cooperation with the U.S.-China Policy Institute at Ajou University for years. Joe Biden and Yoon Summit met in Washington to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the ROK-US alliance on April 26. At the critical juncture of the U.S.-China strategic competition and the great transformation in international and global orders, both leaders met in Washington, D.C. We appreciate the United States hosting our president on a state visit. In this summit, both leaders have agreed to broaden our ironclad bilateral ties comprehensively. There are growing discussions in Korea regarding the evaluations of the summit and then its unresolved issues and then side effects. Today, I invite the three excellent experts from South Korea on these subjects. I sincerely hope that our discussions are fruitful and have our ironclad bilateral ties strengthened. Again, I sincerely appreciate all the efforts from the U.S. side, and then thank you for everybody to join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hoongyu. With that, let me start our discussion. We are lucky to have six distinguished speakers today who will discuss the results of the Biden-Yoon Summit. And obviously, the speakers, each of them have very long bios, but in the interest of time, I'd like to ask the audience to refer to the speakers' bios in the event program. And I think it's already, we already put it up in the chat box. Let me start with the military and diplomatic issues. For this session, I'm joined by Professor Jae-Seung Jeon at Seoul National University, and Sumi Terry, Director of Asia Program and the Hyundai Motor Korea Foundation Center for Korean History and Public Policy at the Wilson Center. With that, let me turn it over to Professor Jae-Seung Jeon for his opening remarks.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I have 3 points about the recent visit. So the first one is the general foreign policy direction of the current administration. So the recent visit is of great significance, not only for the bilateral relationship between two countries, but also for making clearer the general foreign policy direction of the Yoon administration. Although Yoon government is often considered as conservative, which usually stresses the importance of realist logic for national interest, I found that the administration places a strong emphasis on value-based and identity-based diplomacy with a focus on the value of freedom. In that sense, Yoon government's foreign policy is moving towards liberal institutionalism, if I use the academic concept, with the new value of global citizenship or even cosmopolitanism, reflecting the overall trend as South Korea becomes a developed country. The administration's emphasis on international law, opposition to changing the status quo through force, and prioritization of liberal rules-based order, which President Yoon highlighted in this visit, are all in line with the strategy of the Democratic Party in the United States. So it remains to be seen whether this strategic line will be convincing to Korean public and whether it will be realized in concrete policies in the future. More concretely, the second point is regarding North Korea. So the US and South Korea seems to have had deep dialogue on extended deterrence prior to the visit, as expressed in the Washington Declaration. It is evident that US assurance for South Korea was more critical than military deterrence against North Korea itself. So the issue of North Korea policy continues to decline in the States in the US foreign policy priority, and it remains unclear whether this visit will mark a new phase in the Biden administration's North Korea policy. The North Korea issue has various components, including effective deterrence, economic sanctions against North Korean nuclear missile capabilities, improvement of human rights situation in North Korea, resumption of negotiations to resolve the North Korean nuclear issue, and peaceful coexistence and joint development between the two Koreas in the medium and long term. While the Washington Declaration mentions unconditional dialogue with North Korea at the very end of the declaration, in the future, more discussions will be needed to establish a roadmap for future internal negotiations based on a robust military deterrent. The joint statement also specifically addresses North Korea's human rights issue. Pressuring the regime on human rights is only part of the overall problem. Improving the human rights of North Korean people should be an end in itself, and it is also essential to ensure that the regime recognizes the importance of human rights and pursues inter-Korean peace based on respect for human rights. Third point is about Indo-Pacific, the regional security matters. So the cooperation between the United States and South Korea in the Indo-Pacific region has not changed significantly since last year's US-ROK summit. During the summit, the two presidents agreed on a regional security order concerning Taiwan and the South China Sea issue. Only this year, South Korea has released its own Indo-Pacific strategy, which opens up in this visit opportunities for more focused discussions. Moving forward, a significant question for South Korea diplomacy is how to address diplomatic responses from North Korea and China. So far, North Korea has only criticized South Korea through various media and has not taken any concrete physical actions. North Korea's response will hinge on the effectiveness of the nuclear consultative group and how RK and US will pursue extend deterrence with an effort to resume the talk for denuclearization. South Korea must elaborate the so-called bold initiatives with developing further on the issue of political and military side of the initiative, working with the United States. Lastly, China has raised objections ahead of the meeting, as it has done in the past, to present a preemptive narrative on South Korea's foreign policy, South Korea needs to solidify the basis of its security strategy and prevent itself from being overshadowed by China's narrative. Nevertheless, the future relationship with China and South Korea poses a significant challenge for the current administration, the Yoon administration, and diplomatic dialogue must be pursued on a case-by-case basis to address areas of cooperation. So let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Jae-sung. Now, let me ask Sumi to discuss a U.S. view of the results of the summit. Sumi.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Kim. So first, let me just say that, all in all, summit was very successful, right? In the first place, I'll just note that it was a sign of importance that both sides assigned to US-ROK alliance. In the first place, when you have, Biden was the first foreign leader to visit President Yoon when he came into the office. And now President Biden has received President Yoon at the White House as the only second state visit of his presidency. The first was, of course, President Macron of France, America's oldest ally. My point is, these state visits are a very big deal. And as the state visits go, this was, I think, phenomenally successful, particularly from Washington's perspective. Now, in terms of the substance on the security issues front, of course, there were a number of important issues on the agenda that Dr. Chan just gave an excellent overview on. Since he gave such a great overview, and since the number one subject on the agenda on the security issues seem to have been the strengthening extended deterrence, so let me just focus, a few minutes I have on that particular issue. There has been an extensive focus on extended deterrence in light of North Korea's growing and rapidly expanding WMD program, which has understandably raised trepidation in South Korea about whether the United States were really indeed trade Seattle for Seoul, this kind of popular cliche that's been going around. We've all seen polls about how 76%, 77% Korean surveyed expressed support for South Korean nuclear deterrent. And this is a prospect that President Yoon himself raised beginning of the year, and then he will, of course, walk back. So at the White House summit, President Biden and President Yoon obviously reached an agreement that essentially calls for the United States to strengthen our extended deterrence in return for South Korea's commitment to refrain from developing its own nuclear weapons program. And really trying to sort of give this sort of perspective from Washington, this extended deterrence agreement seeks to apply lessons learned from Europe to the new challenges in the Korean Peninsula, and establish this new nuclear consultative group, right? So that is the agreement. This agreement builds on U.S.'s past experience in reassuring U.S. allies of the strength of the U.S.'s commitment, even after, in Europe's case, for example, even after like Soviet Union gained ability to menace or threaten American homeland with nuclear armed bombers and missiles. So among other steps, in Europe, the United States undertook greater levels of consultation on the use of nuclear weapons, stationed tactical nuclear weapons, and it even reached a nuclear sharing arrangement with NATO allies, allowing their aircraft to deliver nuclear munitions in wartime. And while Britain and France did acquire their own independent nuclear arsenal, US security guarantees successfully dissuaded other countries such as Germany and Italy from following that route, right? So again, this agreement builds on US's such previous experiences of reassuring our US allies on the strength of our commitment. So in this statement issued by Biden and Yoon, U.S. recognizes that South Korea has legitimate concerns about North Korea's aggressive posture, which the United States will help address with information sharing about U.S. nuclear systems and more consultation about the use of nuclear weapons, U.S. nuclear weapons in defense of South Korea. And in return, South Korea pledges to remain within the non-proliferation treaty. Moreover, I think the hope from the Biden administration's perspective is that this agreement is an effort to sort of lock in commitments, American commitments, that will bind future US presidents, even if their views are, let's say, more isolationist than the Biden administration, right? So the question now is, will this agreement assuage South Korean concerns? There are some critics that already point out that there is not a lot new here. Some say it's mainly rhetoric. There's not much action. And the rhetoric is, right, the United States commits to making every effort to consult with ROK, South Korea, on any possible nuclear weapons deployment on the Korean Peninsula, right? But of course, as critics point out, this still means while Washington acknowledges the importance of broadening consultation channels, so U.S. cannot and will not be compelled to use nuclear weapons. So it is probably unlikely that this will stop the Korean public's call for going nuclear. A lot will depend on how the North Korean threat evolves. A seventh nuclear test, or over time, when the North continues to expand and modernize its WMD capability, say, for example, when the North shows that it has mastered the technology of miniaturizing nuclear warheads and are able to employ multiple nuclear capable reentry vehicles on a single rocket. These kind of developments, no doubt, will increase alarm in South Korea and its support for nuclear arsenal, or at least force steps such as stationing U.S. tactical nuclear weapons in South Korea, or reaching nuclear sharing agreement that notably were not part of this accord. But at the moment, where we are today, I would say the Washington Declaration is a reasonable compromise. It does show that the Biden administration is sensitive to Korean concerns. It underlines the enduring U.S. commitment to South Korean security, a commitment whose most visible symbol is basically 28,500 military personnel that are stationed in South Korea, right? So in the event of North Korean hostilities or conflict, these troops would be, at the very least, there will be a tripwire, right? There will be a tripwire force that would virtually assure U.S. involvement in such conflicts. So the bottom line on this, I think, is Washington Declaration obviously is a still step in the right direction, although it is unlikely to dampen overall Korean support for pushing or developing their own nuclear capability, particularly in light of the fact of what we all expect, which is continued provocations and missile and WMD development that we can expect coming out of North Korea.
Great, thank you, Sumi. Thank you for providing a lot of food for thoughts, and thank you, Professor Jae-Sung Chun, for your comprehensive analysis of the results of the summit. Now, let me move on to the economic security issue. For this session, I'm joined by Danny Leipziger, Professor of International Business and Managing Director of the Growth Dialogue at GW, and Seung-Ju Lee, Professor at Chungang University. Let me turn it over to Danny.
Well, thank you very much, and hello to all the other panelists. So I've been asked to look at the economic side of the Biden-Yoon Summit, and I think whereas most of the noise is around the Washington Declaration, and as has been mentioned, the confirmation of the reassurances on security in exchange for South Korea remaining a non-nuclear power. There were quite a few things in the leaders' joint statement on the economic side. I think the good news is that I think the differences over the Inflation Reduction Act and even the CHIPS Act were sort of glossed over in a nice diplomatic way, talking about appreciation for lowering the temperature on these issues and focusing more on the benefits of greater cooperation. So I think on the areas that there are some disagreements, I think that was basically dealt with in a good diplomatic way. I think the basic fact, however, that Korea depends tremendously on China for its exports, almost 30%, and also on its imports, 25%, means that the situation that Korea faces, which I describe as being between a rock and a hard place, which is that they need the U.S. for security and they need China for economics, that doesn't change. I think the reality is that one can only imagine a very slow and deliberate decoupling, and I want to come back to that in a moment. But the issue that came out of the declaration between the two nations, I think focused heavily on future technological cooperation, and I think that was a good thing. Because the two countries have complementary capabilities. They have some shared vulnerabilities in terms of supply chains, in terms of cybersecurity, in terms of access to critical materials, and obviously they have mutual defense interests and common values. So I think that's a rich area for future economic interaction. We know that Korean firms are investing heavily in the U.S., not only in cars, but electric batteries, now semiconductors, and now there's some return FDI going into Korea. I think the joint statement has a very useful paragraph or two where they talk about identifying joint R&D activities in advanced product areas, and urging the countries to broaden their collaboration in critical and emerging technologies such as AI, biomedical, semiconductors, quantum, etc. So I think this provides a very rich agenda for future work. Coming back to the decoupling issue, which I think is at the core of the conundrum for South Korea, I think in a way, in the last week before the summit, there was some interesting statements coming out of the U.S. Janet Yellen talking about the fact that decoupling would be disastrous for all concerned, even the NSC director Sullivan talking about the fact that the U.S. is not trying to decouple from China, and even the USTR rep sort of getting on board. So obviously, in that week before, there was a concerted effort to try and limit this talk about decoupling. There's this phrase, small yard, high fence, which has emerged, which is to try to narrow down the areas in which export controls will be imposed, and to try to separate out things that are of higher security or future technological interest from general trade matters. Of course, it's a hard thing to do, and the proof is in the pudding, and particularly since semiconductors are so big in the relationship between China and Korea. The way I see it, not that much has changed on the economic side, but the temperature has been lowered. I happen to be one of those that did not find the Inflation Reduction Act to be as alarming as the Korean side viewed it. I think you have to take it in a broader perspective of dealing with climate change, et cetera. But of course, Korea and the Europeans are upset about it, but I think the temperature has been lowered. The final point I would make is that there was mention of the trilateral relationship, including Japan, and President Yoon was given credit for taking bold first steps in trying to get over this 70-year antagonism between the two countries, because there is a more serious common threat in the region. That's pretty clear. And with geo-fragmentation that we're seeing happening, it's very difficult for countries like Korea to continue to be in the middle, but so far they've managed. But I think strengthening this relationship with Japan or normalizing it would be helpful on the economic side in particular. So let me stop here and come back later after others have spoken. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Let me ask Seung-Ju to discuss a Korean view of the results of the summit on the economic.
Thank you, Professor Kim. And I also would like to thank Professor Kim Eun-gyu for inviting me to this valuable and timely panel. And actually, before I making an assessment about the Yoon-Biden summit, I would like to briefly talk about the main features of South Korea's economic security strategy. For the last several years, actually, South Korea, in terms of economic security strategy, had to deal with the dual challenges. One is the challenges arising from the US-China strategic competition. Here, South Korea had to make a balance between enhancing cooperation with the United States on the one hand, and still securing market access to China on the other hand. And another challenge in terms of the economic security strategy from the perspective of South Korea is that how to remedy the structural vulnerabilities, given that South Korea is one of the few countries in the world with high trade dependence ratio. At the same time, the majority of South Korea trade is conducted in the form of the intra-industry trade, given that it is of highly importance for South Korean government to deal with structural vulnerabilities. Given that for the last several years, South Korean government made a variety of efforts in order to deal with those two challenges. One is that diversification and cooperation with the United States in terms of the Biden administration's reshoring policy. At the same time, South Korea has been making a lot of efforts to stabilize the supply chain as the Korean government tries to provide private companies with financial incentives and tax incentives to stabilize the supply chains. At the same time, the Korean government also placed a high priority to enhancing the sufficiency in high technology as designated by the Korean government 100 key strategic items, particularly in materials, parts, and equipment. That kind of policy was kind of triggered by the Japanese government decision to drop South Korea off the whitelist of the trusted trading partners. Another policy effort made by the South Korean government has been to enhance, to maintain the inclusive posture of the technological sovereignty. South Korea does not seek the technological sovereignty for the sake of sovereignty. Rather, it wants to take advantage of technological sovereignty or sufficiency to enhance or induce other countries' cooperation. And also South Korea has made a lot of efforts to make reshoring. Of course, the numbers itself is not that impressive in terms of reshoring, but one clear signal is that from the period of 2014 to 2021, actually about 126 companies returned to Korea. Out of that number, actually 77% of companies returning to Korea is from China. That vividly shows how the diversification trend of the South Korean companies. Having said that, I would like to briefly make an assessment of the Yoon-Biden summit, I would say in terms of economic security strategy, actually the both countries reaffirmed or agreed to strengthen or even enhance the economic security partnership. I think both countries found each other as a very important and core partners as a process of the supply chain restructuring has been going on. And also, both governments somewhat successfully transformed the partnership into the more tangible outcomes, particularly in the areas of high technology and cybersecurity and space. And also, the bilateral summit put the both countries in a better position to tackle global challenges such as climate change, pandemics, and the natural disasters. And lastly, I would say the bilateral summit also provided some incentive of facilitating role in terms of the resuming the bilateral cooperation between the Korea and Japan, particularly in the framework of the trilateral cooperation among Korea, US, and Japan. So having said that, I would like to make some additional points regarding to the economic security aspect of the bilateral summit. The first one is that I would say that the South Korea has proven itself that it is a perfect or key partner for the US government's multi-layered approach to restructuring the supply chain resilience. I think South Korea is one of the few countries that cooperate with the United States at various levels. I mean, in terms of bilateral level, South Korea has been very much cooperative to the Biden administration's reshoring policy. In the bilateral summit, actually both countries hosted Korea-US supply chain and commercial dialogue and agreed to build 13 plants in the US in the areas of semiconductor, batteries, and autos. And also South Korea has been very much cooperative within the framework of minilateralism as demonstrated by the Chip 4 alliance in semiconductor. Lastly, in terms of the regional minilateral, actually South Korea is one of the key countries, particularly in the area of supply chain pillar of the IPEF. Let me move on to some other issues. Actually, I would say that both countries successfully transformed the framework agreement into the specific outcomes. Actually, one can find the similarities or continuities for the last three bilateral summits, because this is the third one for the last 3 years, actually dating back to the May 2021. The previous Moon Jae-in government also had a bilateral summit with the Biden government, then agreed to comprehensive partnership for a better future. And then in that summit, the emerging technology actually was a symbol of the bilateral cooperation between the two countries. And then 1 year later, the Yoon-Biden summit of May 2022, actually both governments once again agreed to elevate the bilateral relationship to strategic, economic, and technology partnership, and further expanded areas of cooperation between the two. And this bilateral summit, actually both countries successfully transformed the previous framework agreement to the tangible outcomes. As is well known, both countries actually made the 23 MOUs in high technology industries, while 10 agreements actually has to do with how to enhance the industrial competitiveness of the high technology industries, such as batteries, bio, aviation, robotics, and autonomous driving. But some other 13 agreements largely has to do with the high technologies that significantly help tackle the global challenges such as climate change. Also, both countries agreed to strengthen the cooperation in the areas of cybersecurity and the space exploration. One good welcoming sign is that actually both countries' private sector are highly committed in this agreement. So it is, I think, a very good sign, and both countries are very likely to move on to the implementation stage in that regard. Another point I would like to make is that both countries successfully transformed the production cooperation into a tech alliance. Actually, Korean Industry and Trade Minister Lee Chang-yang actually summarized by a bilateral summit that both countries successfully transformed from traditional military and security alliance to a technological alliance. One good sign, in my perspective, is that the South Korean government or South Korean companies were given a chance to tap into the U.S. innovation system. Actually, Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix was allowed to join the National Semiconductor Technology Center, meaning that those two companies will be eligible for U.S. subsidies for semiconductor R&Ds, and then both two countries will substantially collaborate with the U.S. companies to develop next generation devices, materials, advanced packaging of the semiconductors. Having said that, I would like to touching upon a few future challenges down the road. One is that in terms of Korea, from the perspective of Korea, there are some discrepancies between national interest and corporate interest, because from the perspective of private companies, they are full of uncertainties. This kind of perception is well reflected in the remarks of the Federation of Medium-Sized Enterprise of Korea. They said it is a little bit unfortunate for the Korean government has not been able to come up with additional measures related to the IRA and CHIPS and Science Act. Another caveat of the bilateral summit has to do with the Chip 4 alliance. Of course, the South Korean government made it clear to the US government it would join the Chip 4 alliance, but exactly how to run that alliance would be a little bit unclear from the perspective of South Korea. And the last point I would like to make is that the level of policy alignment between the two countries has substantially increased. But at the same time, that kind of alignment may run the risk of China's aggressive diplomacy from the perspective of Korea. Actually, South Korean government made it clear that the bilateral summit simply affirmed the existing stance of South Korea, not targeting any specific country. But Chinese, if we look at the Chinese response, actually Chinese government called the bilateral summit stern negotiation, which is an expression for the Chinese government to criticize foreign governments. So in that regard, I would like to say that it is about time for the two countries specifically talk about the possibility of collective resilience. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Seung-ju, and thank you for the detailed information that not many of people were aware of. Our last topic is domestic reactions. Two journalists from Seoul and Washington joined us today. Jung-eun Lee, editorial writer at 동아일보, and Josh Rajin, columnist at the Washington Post and a proud member of Yeol School alum. Welcome to your alma mater. Jung-eun?
Yeah, so thank you. So first of all, I just would like to show some of the Korean media outlets. For example, like when you see this one by one, you can see that all the front pages are like all about the summit, and you can see the big pictures, and it's like all like covered with many pictures, filled 3 or 4 pages, almost a whole week, one day by day. So you can see that it dominated all the other domestic issue, very big event, which draws such huge attention. So generally, I would say that the public and especially the experts' reaction is positive. However, there are also voices expressing disappointment and concerns. So I would say that the public reaction is mixed, more frankly, quite polarized. So then let's see the public survey. There is one that came right after the summit. According to the Real Meter survey, which was conducted from the 24th to 28th, President Yoon's supporting rate is 35.5%, almost 2% point higher than a week earlier. So Yoon's supporting rate has been declining for 4 consecutive weeks, then it's back on the rise again. So considering the survey period, we can tell that the summit had a very positive impact, especially the Yoon's Congress in English had a good impact on it. And he's singing American Pie at the state dinner, impressed Korean people. And now if we see the media reports, the conservative media welcomed and applauded the outcome of the summit. So with all the achievements explained by the expert here before me today, President Yoon's performances like English speech and songs especially draw huge attention among Koreans. So very nice touchy-feely moment for building leaders' mutual trust. So it is well addressed to the public that the summit marks the new milestone for another 70 years of new and evolving alliance in the future. They also pointed out that it was a very important turning point in South Korea's foreign policy. One conservative newspaper put the headline with expressions like the diplomatic success. On the contrary, half the opinion, mostly expressed by the liberal media outlets, is quite negative. So they question the effectiveness of Washington Declaration, saying that it does not contain any concrete measures to actually stop DPRK nuclear threat. They also criticized the issue of IRA and Chips and Science Act had not reserved even at the highest summit level. Well, I would say that expectations and demand for the solution of these two issues were especially high in Korea. And more broadly, some media outlets criticized that Yoon went too far to the US side, so leaving little room for diplomacy with China or Russia. For example, one of the most liberal newspaper outlet put the headline as Yoon put South Korea on front line of neo-Cold War, and that Yoon's pro-American policy could end up raising regional tensions. While the contrast between conservative and liberal media outlets are quite clear, in politics, that of ruling party and opposition party are even more stark. So even when considering ideological polarization in Korean society, these assessments and reactions are so different. So for example, the ruling party, People Power Party, touted the summit as a significant diplomatic success, a big gain. However, the opposition Democratic Party is unprecedentedly harsh, fiercely denounced and downplayed President Yoon's state visit. So they criticize it as like empty, vague, humiliating, even like fraud diplomacy. They said that Yoon made Korea as like US purse, and they call Yoon the US sucker, like meaning that Korea gave too much for too little gain. So the Korean government is now on an aggressive public relations campaign to let people understand the meaning of this summit and what they got from it. Senior officials are now on the front line on TV or on newspaper with the interviews and the op-ed and seminars for that. So I would say it is still an open ending for South Koreans. Further public reactions will depend on the extent to which South Korea and the US actually fulfill the promises made at the summit. So for example, how the NCG, I mean, Nuclear Consultative Group, will work in the future, how effectively it will deter North Korean nuclear threats, how economic and technological cooperation will be organized in a way that is not self-serving, I mean, America first, but mutual win-win for the alliance like South Korea. The media will be following on the issues closely, and I'll do that as well as a journalist. So I'll stop here. Back to you, Yeol.
Thank you, Jung-eun. Josh, thank you for your patience. Now you have the last word, and I guess you're going to start with American Pie.
Well, yeah, as they say, almost everything has been said, but not everyone has said it. So if I repeat something that another expert said, please forgive me. But I do wish to give you the perspective of a American non-expert. That's me. And of course, the visit, the state visit, the pageantry, the speech to Congress, the very touching moments between President Biden and President Yoon, the fact that he sang American Pie, the fact that he mentioned BTS and Blackpink in his speech. These were all very warm and kind of breakthrough notes. And I think that you know, this kind of public diplomacy is crucially important because you know, while the U.S.-South Korea relationship is very big news and sold. To be quite honest, in Washington, it's very hard for it to garnish much public attention amidst all of the other problems that the administration and that the country is going through. And, the previous to the Yoon visit, the most we heard about South Korea in the news was during the leak of the Pentagon intel documents. That's where I actually wanted to start, because that's what was on the mind of Americans when Yoon showed up into town, that South Korea, a staunch U.S. ally, was spied on by the Biden administration. And what the spying revealed was that the South Korean government is very torn, very understandably, about its position in Ukraine, whether or not to supply lethal weapons to the Ukrainians. And of course, the Americans, being very sensitive to that dynamic, were trying to do it, urge them to do it secretly through a third party, as was revealed by the leaks. And now it's not a secret, and now that plan is a controversy. And I think that speaks to the difficulty, once you get past the surface interactions of top U.S. and South Korean officials, of navigating what's a very complex world in which the U.S. and South Korea have many overlapping interests, but not all overlapping interests. And I agree with many of the panelists that this summit focused on the good and glossed over the difficult. And while we can call that a success, I think it's worthy for me to take this 5 minutes that I have to not gloss over the difficult and to point out some of the issues that remain, even if that wasn't the message of the summit that was intended. Ukraine is one of them. The problem remains. The Ukrainians are running out of ammunition fast, and the South Koreans are one of the very only places that can produce it in the quantities that it's going to be needed, perhaps for another year, perhaps for another 5 years. And Europe and America are not ramping up their production for other reasons. So South Korea still has to decide whether or not it's going to find a way to get tons and tons of shells, ammunition shells, to the Ukrainians, which they desperately need. That problem is not going away. When we talk about the Washington Declaration, again, I think everything that everyone said about the positive signals that it sends are fair. At the same time, has to be an acknowledgement that it leaves some of the very core issues unresolved, including, as we saw from the differing statements by the two leaders, what exactly the consultation and the assurance is. And this is again a problem that's not going away. And we talk about Japan, South Korea rapprochement. This is something that is very rightfully praised in Washington. And we're going to see more of it. We're going to hopefully see a South Korea-Japan summit. We'll see a trilateral meeting in Hiroshima in some form soon, aside the G7. But, from my reporting and from my discussions with both South Korean and Japanese officials, this warming had very little to do with U.S. intervention. In fact, it has to do with a shared acknowledgement by both South Korea and Japan that the U.S. security commitment is less believed in, that the region is less confident in it. And again, that's a structural problem, and it's partially because we don't know who's going to be president in the United States in a year or in a couple of years. And there's no benefit in avoiding the fact that the U.S. Commitment to deterrence in Asia is losing political support, especially in the far right and far left of American politics. When it comes to the economics, I'll just go through this very briefly. Again, I think the statements were very rightfully praised for noting that the alliance is expanding to include high-tech economic and cyber elements. And, there's a lot of discussion about friendshoring and coordinating investments in tech, and everyone's saying all the right things. But when the rubber meets the road, I think some of the key issues remain, pretty clearly unresolved. And what am I talking about? Well, Chinese coercion of American companies is about to start in earnest. And when Beijing cuts off Micron, for example, and the Biden administration asks the Yoon administration not to fill that gap by selling more to China, is that really something that South Korea is going to do? Is that really something that's in South Korea's interest? I don't think we really know. And, again, they've discussed the Inflation Reduction Act and, the protectionist measures taken by the United States. But I haven't seen any evidence that those have been resolved in any real way. And, how can America be protectionist and also friendshoring at the same time? And I think when we talk about decoupling, decoupling is something of a straw man. It's a word that people use. I think what most of us are talking about is de-risking, and de-risking is a very complicated process that I think is falling very way behind the increasing of the risk, in other words. So, again, the statements are good, but, we'll have to see what happens in the follow through. I think in the end, what we're seeing in the US side is a shift of focus in Asia from the Northeast to the Southwest. Okay. And when I talk to US security officials, and when you see the subsequent visit of Filipino President Marcos, you realize that all of the incentives are for moving US Indo-Pacific supply, focus, attention closer to Taiwan. That's the scenario that everyone's building towards. And in a world of limited resources where, the Ukraine war is taking a lot of time of attention, and also taking a lot of material resources away that might have gone to East Asia, it stands to reason that, that the North Korea threat is losing priority, in other words. And that brings me to my last and final point, which is sort of, it's very clear that the Yoon administration and the Biden administration agree that now is not the right time to engage North Korea, or at the very least that North Korea has no interest in engaging right now. But again, I think it's only honest to say that eventually that's an untenable situation. Again, one, because the Biden administration won't last forever, and the Yoon administration won't last forever. And, there's going to be increasing pressure, I think, in Washington to have some sort of answer to the question of how do we engage Pyongyang, or at least try, at least show that we're trying. And, again, I think that was something that both sides were happy to not discuss at this summit, but it's an issue that we should discuss nonetheless. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Josh. Before we start the roundtable discussion, I'd like to remind the attendees that we are taking questions from you, and that the Q&A box is already open. So when you type in your questions, please make sure to identify your name and affiliation. Now, let me open it up for a roundtable discussion for the next like 20 minutes or so. I think Josh just threw a lot of good questions to all the panelists. So if there's anybody who want to respond to Josh's question or comments, please let me know.
I'll start if you don't have any other volunteers. Well, first of all, I think Professor Lee gave a lot of detail on the positives on the economic side of things that were actually discussed. I think the issue really is that on the nuclear deterrent, it's very hard to do any assessment, right? Because how are these advanced consultations on nuclear preparation going to proceed? We won't know that. And so that's sort of vague, but I understand that the assurances were given. The Washington Declaration is important. It's, as others have said, it's not going to quell the desire by some in South Korea to have their own nuclear weapons, or to get the U.S. to reverse its withdrawal of tactical nukes. But on the economic side, one can look at monitorable things, right? I think that's an area where one could not only look at the investment plans of the Koreans, but also greater collaboration in R&D, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's something that's monitorable. I think the other point that was made is that we haven't seen yet what the Chinese reaction will be. We have sort of the overall, diplomatic, rhetorical stuff that I'm sure we're going to get from them. But I think on the specific case of Micron or things of that sort, we're going to have to see how Korea manages this kind of pressure. I think the difficulty in these relationships is that individual episodes and individual cases take on a life of their own, you know? And I think one has to look at the overall relationship. Yeah, there are going to be these stresses and strains, you know, it's like any marriage, there are going to be some problems. But I think highlighting the problems and not highlighting the cooperative side may give a false impression that the U.S.-Korea relationship is in economic difficulty, which I don't think is true. I think the cooperative areas are outweigh these problematic areas. And so I think from that perspective, I think the summit was a positive step on the economic side.
Thank you, Danny. Any comments or questions on the military and security or diplomatic side?
I mean, I agree with Danny in the sense that, you know, of course there are still issues, but I think, Josh, I think for people who have worked on these summits before, they don't have a high expectation. I mean, I buy everything that Josh said. There, of course, even in the closest alliance relationship, and you know, there are going to be issues, and I'm glad he pointed those out. But all in all, even on the security side, I think it's still considered success. Yes, I understand this whole thing about this agreement. You know, I am of the view that, to be very frank, these consultations will not be enough to dampen South Korean public's call for nuclear weapons, and B, they're not going to be enough to deter North Korea. And I'm pretty confident that North Korea is going to be on this path that they have been on, with some 100 tests last year, 30 tests this year. They're on this path with external environment being super favorable for North Korea to continue on this path. So this anxiety will absolutely continue. And I do think there can be more that can be done on the extended deterrence front. For example, you know, I always thought it's possible to strengthen extended deterrence without going to the route of bringing tactical nuclear weapons back, or, you know, or South Korea having to develop their own nuclear weapons program, by doing something more than where we are, which is a consultation. And that, like, for example, you know, a policy of strategic ambiguity of some sort. You know, we can deploy rotating more nuclear capable weapon systems to South Korea without necessarily commenting on whether they're nuclear armed or not. You know, leave North Koreans guessing. I mean, there are things that we can do more, and I'm sure they will come. So what I was saying is, earlier in terms of summit and when it produced, yes, it doesn't solve all these issues. There are going to be remaining problems, but for now, realistically speaking, it's a step forward generally in a positive direction. Why it doesn't take care of all the underlying concerns, as Josh pointed out.
Let me ask a follow-up question to our Korean speakers. That includes Heung-kyu. So the agreements on especially the extended deterrence at the summit, how do you think this will impact the public opinion in South Korea regarding South Korea's nuclear armament?
Well, there has been surveys about whether South Koreans prefer independent nuclear arming. But if we ask deeper, with various repercussions on South Korean economy or military preparedness, if South Korea go nuclear, then I think the result will be very different. If we go out of NPT, and the Yoon Suk-yeol statement that we will remain as a member of NPT is not really a quid pro quo to the U.S. asking. It's our own policy as a so-called global pivotal state. We want to observe the basic obligations NPT, because NPT contributes to the non-nuclear world. It's a mechanism to prevent proliferation of nuclear weapons. If we permit more proliferation, then we'll have more possibility of nuclear war or even nuclear terrorism. So our decision to remain as a member of NPT, it's our own decision, which actually, coherent with U.S. policy. So it's our own decision. But if we go out of NPT, there will be a lot of repercussions. There might be some economic negative results for international community. We cannot buy any uranium for our own atomic energy development and so on. So if all things considered, then South Korean public will have another judgment. It will not go up to the 60 or 70%. So we have to check every possible options for deterrence. For example, deployment of U.S. tactical nuclear weapons or nuclear sharing, going nuclear, all those, various options. If we go nuclear, then we have also other things to consider. What kind of delivery system that we have? If we have South Korea, South Korea have nuclear weapons, then will we have more stable relations with North Korea, overcoming all the crisis stability with North Korea? There might be some more possibility of North Korea feeling temptation to nuclear weapons first before South Korea uses nuclear weapons. So there are a lot of questions that follows if we want to go nuclear. So all things considered, the Washington Declaration find the best results so far, having more robust nuclear extended deterrence. So for the last several months in South Korea, there are a lot of discussions of what kind of options can we have. And now I think in the meantime, we have the best option so far. But nuclear deterrence is an evolving system. We cannot have 100% perfect deterrence system because it's psychological, especially on the assurance side. So I think it's a good sign that two countries had a result of consultation after all these evolving situations.
Thank you, Jae-sung. Heung-kyu, Seung-ju, do you have anything to add?
Okay, the current problem is the incapable of deterrence structure the South Korea and the United States possess against the North Korea's nuclear missile capabilities. So it is not that defensible. So but the current extended deterrence still requires South Korea to heavily rely upon the U.S. willingness to deter North Korea's aggression. So the current agreements may be important for the South Korean people at this moment, but in the future it is going to have a fluctuation in public opinion depending upon the ROK U.S. alliance. But there is a kind of deep comprehension in South Korean people because North Korea is getting more aggressive, and then the vulnerability of South Korea's defense system is getting more and more in trouble. So there is a widening gap between the defense and then also the some our psychologies. So still is troublesome, and but the problem is the Moon Jae-in government and then also the Yoon Suk-yeol governments are not able to provide enough assurance to the Korean people how to defend on the North Koreans nuclear missile capabilities.
Thank you, Heung-kyu. Yes, Seung-ju.
Yeah, actually, I don't have too much to add on the Professor Johnson, Professor Kim's point, but from the perspective of the economic security, I would like to highlight that both countries agreed to cooperate to the peaceful use of nuclear power generation, SMR. Actually, Korean KHNP and SK Innovation signed an agreement with the U.S. TerraPower to jointly push for the project and the construction of and operation of the fourth generation SMR. I think that is a kind of meaningful as well as tangible progress from the perspective of the peaceful use of nuclear power.
Okay, for the sake of, Chairman, did you have anything to say?
Well, I just agree. And then, the North Korea already started their exponential increase of the nukes, and then there is always high possibility of doing the seventh nuclear test. And recently, even they announced a plan of launching the surveillance satellite. So everything, I totally agree with Sumi that these kind of Washington declaration would not be enough to like sacrifice Korean people for now. So it was interesting to see that even very conservative media like expressed their disappointment about the Washington Declaration on the first day of the summit. But as I already said, that we'll see if the two countries show that it's not just about another paper, and then there will work as a really effective deterrence for the from the North Korean nukes, then I think the public opinion could change, and then it will help Yoon administration to like go with their own new policies with the United States.
Thank you. And for the sake of debate, let me ask this question. So I think Josh raised a very good question about whether protectionist approach and friendshoring can go side by side effectively. And Professor Seung-Ju Lee, she also pointed out that the corporate interest and national interest are not always the same, especially when you're looking at the 2024 US presidential election. South Korean companies may have some concerns about whether the US economic security policy would dramatically change. So I think Danny, you might have something to say about this.
I'll try. I think forgetting about the 2024 election for the moment, there's no doubt that once you open this area of friendshoring national security, it's the thin edge of the wedge. So you quickly get into protectionist areas. I think coming at a broader level, I think it's pretty clear that the Biden administration is also looking at 2024, and a lot of these protectionist measures have some implications for what we would call swing states in areas that are politically of interest. But I don't think one should. I think the main issue is that this is such a departure from what the U.S. has normally been advocating, that it's taken on a lot of concern. Adam Posen from the Peterson Institute talks about the lose-lose situation of industrial policy. I view it slightly differently, which is that I see two positives. One is that to move the climate change agenda in the United States, you need to provide subsidies rather than taxes. You can try carbon taxes in Europe, you can never do it in the US. So you have to provide subsidies. The question then is, how are they deployed? Can you make exceptions for certain friends? I think that gets down into the individual cases. And the second is that there is this area of competition between the US and China, which is very clear. The security and technological advantage part of competition is very real. So Korea is a bystander in this. And at the end, because Korea and the US are allies, we have to look for those areas where you can get greater cooperation. And I think there are plenty of areas for that. I therefore repeat that I would not focus on those areas of conflict, which are always going to occur. Airbus and Boeing, our biggest allies in Europe, where they've been fighting for 20 years and they both get illegal subsidies. So, you can always find cases where protectionism is at work. I think the world has gotten more difficult with the US-China competition and with Ukraine war polarizing countries. So I think that we should look at the positive on this one, because I think there are more positive cases than negative.
Thank you. Josh, I saw your hand raised.
Sure. Yeah, no, I just wanted to make a couple of quick comments in reaction to some of the reaction. Again, and not as a Korea expert, but just as a journalist covering the Biden administration and other administrations before it. First of all, on deterrence, right? So, if we can all sit here and sort of agree that, the Washington Declaration was a small step in the right direction, but does not address rising concerns with a lack of deterrence of North Korea. That's not focusing on the negative. That's focusing on the reality of the situation, which is that the threat is growing very quickly, that the capability is growing, that North Korea has adjusted its nuclear doctrine and the way it says it intends to use nuclear weapons, and that, the growing tensions in the region and the buildup towards a Taiwan contingency that could very easily spill over into a North Korea contingency. In fact, I think most planners would have to assume that a Taiwan contingency would very rapidly expand into a North Korea contingency. I think we have to look at that as a big picture and just be very honest about the fact that our deterrence broadly in the region is becoming less and less credible, and also that one of the lessons of the Ukraine war should be, and this is something that President Zelensky has said, including directly to me, is that we can't tell ourselves a story about deterrence that makes us feel good and then realize after it's too late that the deterrence wasn't meeting the threat apace. In other words, the best way to avoid war is to increase the deterrence, not just through things like the Washington Declaration, but through actual material readiness and other types of increases in the U.S. commitment, frankly. So I just think that that's just my view on the deterrence question. When it comes to, I thought it was very interesting, the discussion about the difference between corporate and national interests, because I've been reporting a lot lately on the battle about this inside the Biden administration when it comes to the U.S.-China economic relationship. And I think it's very, very important to put the U.S.-South Korea economic relationship squarely in this context, because right now we're having the Biden administration is having a huge internal fight over this very issue, over, what does it mean to de-risk, and what needs to be protected, and what needs to be decoupled, and what needs to be reinforced. And, is it just the high technologies? Is it just AI? Should it include biotechnology? Should it include clean energy technology? These are huge, multi-billion-dollar U.S. industries that are heavily, heavily dependent on China. So it's not as if South Korea is alone in being dependent on the Chinese economy. U.S. high technology is very, very dependent on Chinese labor, Chinese material, many of it linked to Chinese companies that are problematic, many of it linked to the Chinese government, many of it linked to forced labor and other illicit practices. And untangling all of that is not a resolved issue inside the Biden administration, quite the contrary. And right now we have a fight between those parts of the government that are working on behalf of U.S. corporate interests. I'm talking about the Treasury Department and large parts of the Commerce Department, fighting against the national security people. And when we have a U.S.-South Korea summit, we focus on the strategic, and because it's handled mostly by the NSC and the State Department, and sometimes we can fail to realize that actually U.S.-China policy is very much at this point headed in the direction of being under more purview of the economic officials. And that is, in a sense, contradictory to the U.S. drive to push South Korea to de-risk and to selectively side with the U.S. over China. And so all I'm saying is that, without getting too far afield, is that until the United States has a comprehensive investment and trade policy for Asia, and I don't think that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework represents one, and until the U.S. has figured out its own strategy for managing the risk of economic dependence on China and economic security with China, it's very, very hard for us to preach much or convince our allies to go along with a policy that we simply haven't finished crafting. And I don't blame the South Koreans for being confused and for being caught in the middle of that. At the same time, it's clearly going in one direction. And, South Korea is not of course, can't be asked to choose between the United States and China, but on certain key issues, they're going to have to choose. And I just hope that eventually the U.S. system can muster the competency and the initiative to give South Korea a better choice. In other words, a more advantageous choice, both economically and strategically, when those decisions come due.
Okay, thank you, Josh. We plan to have a 15-minute Q&A. So, but I already have 3 hands raised by the speakers. So I'd like to ask the 3 speakers to make your comments a little bit brief. Let me start with Heung-kyu, and then Chang-eun, and then Seung-ju.
Okay, also leaders in this summit talk about security more, but they are not detailed economic cooperation, So the future relationship is heavily depends on how we fulfill the deficit of economic cooperation in detailed manners. And the second, my point is what is the end state of the U.S.-China policies? I basically agree with Josh's arguments, and then so what are the difference between the Democratic Party and the Republican parties on China policies? And then without clarifying your policies, it's extremely difficult for us to take a kind of policies and what is your anticipated role of South Korea on China. This is not really clear, and sometimes it made us quite confused. So I would like to listen to American friends, and what is your end state of China policies?
Nobody knows.
And my question would be a little bit similar, just to follow up on Heung-kyu. Again, I also totally agree with Josh, but the size and the volume of the economy and the situation and geopolitical situation, everything so different from Korea and the United States. So you see that the China and the Russia responded really angrily to Yoon's Reuters comments and the joint statement. So they condemned and criticized it. So I would like to ask Josh and Danny as well. Do you think that the Korea could face another economic retaliation from China or Russia? Because we already had a very painful one in 2016 because of the THAAD deployments. And if so, how should Korea respond to that? You expect, and what can we expect, or should we ask for from the US as an ally? Thank you.
Yeah, Seung-ju.
Yes, thank you. A couple of issues. Actually, yeah, in my opening remarks, I stressed the importance of diversification, but that does not necessarily mean the Korean companies should leave the Chinese market. China as a market is still important. Actually, the majority of Korean companies would be very much interested in making products for the Chinese market. So in that regard, it is about time for South Korean government as well as Korean companies to think about how to transform from the made in China strategy to made for China strategy. I think that is the kind of the essence of the South Korea's economic security strategy. Another thing is that as a trade-dependent country, the South Korean government has to be very wary of the spread of the protectionism and nationalism. In that regard, I would say, in terms of economic security strategy, South Korea should avoid the risks involved in the securitization of the industry and high technology. Actually, in the case of the Chip 4 alliance, actually, if we rule out the possibility of the over-securitization, actually, those 4 countries are the actually natural partners. Actually, United States with the comparative advantage in design and equipment, and the South Korea and Taiwan with a comparative advantage in the manufacturing capacity, and the Japan again in materials and equipment. Actually, they are very good natural combination of the partnerships. So in that regard, I would say we need to rule out the possibility of the over-securitization. Of course, we have to keep in mind that this is the day of economic security, but always one thing we have to keep in mind is that the over-securitization is dangerous and as well as risky.
Before we open it up for the Q&A, Sue, did you have anything to respond to comments made by the Korean friends?
I think it's okay because we have like 9 minutes and I see a lot of questions on the list here.
Then let me pick the first question from Will Tuggle. So there has been increasing effort to rely less on Taiwan for the, on the US side for the world's semiconductor manufacturing with the passing of GWIKS Act. Do you see South Korea passing a similar act or making more advancements in producing their own semiconductors in order to rely less on Taiwan in the event of a Chinese intervention? I think Seung-ju, you are in a good position to answer the question.
Not sure whether I'm in a good position to respond to that question, but I'll try. Actually, again, in my opening remarks, I pointed out that the both countries successfully transformed the framework agreement into the tangible outcomes in the areas of high technology, such as semiconductor. Actually, the gist of the both US and South Korean supply chain strategy is the diversification, how to spread the risks. In that regard, it is one thing to reduce the reliance on the Taiwan's TSMC, but it is another thing that too much concentration on the US soil of the United States. So in that regard, it is highly important to spread the risks. So too much reshoring would be, again, risky even for the United States. So in that regard, I would say US government is very much interested in combining reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, and ally shoring. Those are the good combination of the US policy in order to spread the risks involved in the process of the supply chain restructuring. And also from the perspective of South Korea, actually, again, in my opening remarks, I emphasized that from the perspective of Korea, it is highly important to tap into the US innovation system. Actually, it is very important for South Korea to stay competitive in the semiconductor industry. But until pretty recently, both countries, I mean the US and South Korea, basically worked on the level of the production cooperation. So this time, in the bilateral summit, actually the Korean government actually secured a chance to tap into the US innovation system as they allowed to join the NSTC. So I think it is a kind of the very beginning of the collaboration at the level of the Tech Alliance.
Thank you. Josh, did you raise hand again?
Yes, very, very quick point on this. I just wanted to make sure everyone understands that under the CHIPS Act, there is no real prospect of reducing the world's reliance on Taiwanese semiconductors for the very simple reason that all of the CHIPS money will go to building foundries for not the latest generation of chip technology. So even if it goes to plan, which is a big if, we'll be producing older model chips 10 years from now. So the uniqueness of the TMC infrastructure and supply chains in Taiwan will continue to be unique for the next generation, even under the most rosy scenario. So make of that what you will. Either some people say that means that's a silicone shield and we should protect Taiwan. Some of that means that we should try to convince the Taiwanese to move their best stuff over to the US, but it's pretty clear to me that the Taiwanese are not going to do that, and they say they can't do that. So I just would like to lower everybody's expectations on the CHIPS Act. It's not actually going to do much except for give a very hefty subsidy to a very profitable industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Next question is from Joo-hee Chung, a PhD candidate in Heidelberg University. The question is about the meaning of the term freedom that President Yoon has been emphasizing. So during the discussions of the South Korean version of the Indo-Pacific strategy, President Yoon has used the term freedom frequently. since taking office. And during his recent visit to Washington, he stated that South Korea will play a role as a compass for freedom with the United States. In Japan again, freedom, the word freedom was used. So Chui is curious about the diplomatic underlying meaning or significance of the term compass for freedom from South Korea's perspective.
Well, I don't know. President Yoon personally likes the term freedom, so we don't know exactly what he means when he addresses the value of freedom. We can just speculate. But in South Korea, there is a view that South Korea has been a beneficiary of liberal international order led by the United States from 1945. After we experienced Trump era, the so-called illiberal hegemon, then in South Korea, we have to contribute to the maintenance or strengthening of liberal order, which is supported by international law, all the norms and rules. So I think President Yoon might have some ideas about what we can do as a major maintainer of that liberal order. Second thing is that after the visit, our presidential office made a statement that we want to participate in the leadership group for the global order as a now a kind of advanced country. So we know that we are faced with many challenges globally. So United States cannot face alone. So we have to help the United States as a part of the leadership group. So maybe that is what President Yoon meant when he talks about compass to freedom. And thirdly, and more South Korean people think that China is a systematic challenger or challenge, as NATO, stated in the last summit meeting last year in Madrid. So because we put much emphasis on freedom, authoritarian or even autocratic regime cannot have a place in liberal international order. So probably the relationship among liberal democracies will prosper in the future. That's what probably President Yoon has in mind.
Thank you. Josh, I see your hand raised.
Sure. No, I just wanted to give the corresponding U.S. side of that answer, which is simply that I think President Biden, like President Yoon, speaks like an idealist, but acts like a realist. This is the best way to understand the Biden foreign policy, is that he talks a big game about a grand struggle, a strategic competition between democracies and autocracies, but actually he implements that kind of values-based approach on a very selective case-by-case basis. And Ukraine, sure, yeah, we're fighting for freedom. In the global South, in the Middle East, we're retrenching to a reliance on some pretty authoritarian actors. And I just think there's an argument for that, but it's also creates misunderstanding when they have a democracy summit in the United States and nobody can really define which countries should go and which countries shouldn't go, and it sort of becomes a muddled message. I do think that in the end you need to be a realist in order to take steps forward in diplomacy, but you need to be an idealist to know which direction you're headed.
Yes, Hongyu.
Yoon's philosophical orientation is like speaking like an idealist and then behaving like an idealist. So that causes lots of trouble in some part of Korean people, and then so we worry about the kind of a pleasant risk from the China and the Russia, and so we continue to ask ourselves and then how to cooperate with the United States in case the Russia and China kind of took kind of revenge against the South Korea. So but we are not sure at this moment.
Yeah, I think just very simply put, it seems to me the use of the word freedom is everything, like we just said, like an idealist, right? So he kind of used it for value-driven foreign policy. I think he means that human rights. He means even when he says, I'm going to be less differential to China, even he talks about rule of law, when he even talking about courage in solving difficult problems, I think it's kind of a word that kind of encompasses all of those things. So it's hard to sort of say exactly, I think that's how he uses the word freedom. I see it that way, sort of like, we're going to be, our foreign policy is just like what Dr. Kim just said. He's an idealist, so it's kind of a value-driven, more emphasis on that. I think that's what he means by freedom. Who knows, but that's how I at least interpret it.
Danny?
Yeah, I was going to just give a comment or two back on the economic side. I think there are two trends that we have to take into account looking at Korea. One is that it's in Korea's interest to reduce its dependence on China. If you look at the China, 2025 report, which was issued, in 2015, it was pretty clear that China was also trying to reduce its dependence on others and import substitutes. So that whole, supply chain diversification, et cetera, that all makes perfect sense. Someone asked about the THAAD experience and whether China would respond. And I think that in the situation that we see now, in individual cases, I think the U.S. has to be rather careful in what they expect from Korea, because I think China will respond. So this Micron issue is a good sort of mini example. And I think, I at one time in my life, I also worked in the State Department. I think we have to realize that the U.S.-Korea partnership is not an equal partnership. And sometimes what the U.S. expects from Korea will be unfair or not deliverable. And I think that's what makes the policy challenge so big for Korea, because not only do they have to care about what the U.S. response is, but they have to care what the Chinese response is. And they have to weigh these two and try to find a way out of it. So that's why I keep coming back to the positives, because they're going to be these irritants. They're going to be these negative cases. They're going to be these problems. The question is, can you, on the other side of the ledger, have enough positive things going on that outweigh these individual cases?
Thank you, Danny. I think that was really great remarks for wrapping up today's webinar. It's already past 1:30, so I think we need to wrap it up now. I'd like to thank all the distinguished speakers for joining us today, especially our Korean speakers for staying up late at night for us. I'd also like to thank our GWIKS team for putting this together. And of course, thank you all for joining us. With that, let me conclude today's webinar. Thank you.